Hi, everyone. Welcome to Exploring Health, Macro to Micro. I'm your host, Parker Condit. In the show, I interview health and wellness experts around topics like sleep, exercise, nutrition, stress management, mental health, and much more. So by the end of each episode, you'll have concrete, tangible advice that you can start implementing today to start living a healthier life, either for yourself or for your loved ones. And that's the micro side of the show. The macro side of the show is discussing larger systemic issues that are contributing to health outcomes. An example of that is understanding how our food is grown can have a profound impact on the quality of that food, the soil, and the environment at large. My guest today discussing that is Matthieu Mehuys. Matthieu is the co-founder of Polonia Landscape Architects. Their mission is to create sustainable and ecological outdoor spaces where people and nature are in harmony. He has a master's of engineering in landscape architecture and has a goal to make our world a greener, healthier place. We talk a lot about soil in this episode, which is something I never thought I would base a whole episode around, but alas, here we are. But I do think from a foundational standpoint, it's really important to understand that the quality of your food is going to be determined largely by the quality of the soil where that food is grown. So if you eat food, and I'm assuming that most of you listening do eat food, and you care about your health, then understanding soil is actually a really important aspect of that. And I get that this is probably a topic that not a lot of people are actively pursuing, but I think it's very important nonetheless. So I think this episode can act as a way to get a bit of a more well-rounded understanding of the agricultural ecosystem as a whole. So in the show, we end up discussing soil and how it influences the quality of our food. We talk about regenerative farming and clear examples of how it outpaces traditional farming. We go into Matthieu's upbringing and how he was raised in a farming family and how that's helped shape his worldview. He introduced me to the idea of harvesting sunlight, which was a very helpful term for me to understand carbon capture. And then finally, we talk about how the future of business is going to be working more in line with the harmony in nature, which is a common theme throughout this episode. And then finally, I want to mention that Matthieu is the author of the recently published book, 12 Universal Laws of Nature, How to Use Your Land to Its Full Potential, which expands on many of the topics that we discuss here today. So without further delay, please enjoy my conversation with Matthieu Mehuys. Matthieu, thanks so much for being here. We're going to be talking a lot about sustainability, landscape design, architecture, green spaces, but I do want to start with this recent study that just came out of the University of Michigan, approximately saying that having like an at-home garden has 5 to 6 times the carbon footprint of traditional farming per unit of fruit or vegetable. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on this, just to see what the tone of this conversation is going to be.
Yeah, definitely. But first of all, Parker, thank you very much for having me on the show. It's an honor here to talk about what you do and what we can bring together into the world. Now, I think this study, I would want to read the details of it, but I think I cannot believe that is nowhere near the truth. Obviously, it's just a statement that you cannot prove, right? Like, how do they even measure saying that people at home have a higher carbon footprint than food that is grown somewhere else? Like, there's ways that if you grow food at home on your own, in your own garden, and you do it in a certain way, which we can discuss more about it, that you're actually going to be carbon negative. Because as it turns out, how plants work is that you probably heard of photosynthesis, but plants will take carbon from the atmosphere and put it into the soil. Now, obviously, if you have a home garden and you use all kinds of pesticides and you spray everything at home, then this garden is definitely going to be a carbon, like it's going to pollute the atmosphere. That's 100% clear. But if you do it the right way, which is in harmony with nature, you're actually going to be storing carbon into the soil. So I think this research is very, very, very dangerous, honestly.
Yeah, so I did look into it a little bit. A big part of what the research was saying was it was the infrastructure of setting up the home garden, like all the tools you need to buy, the sheds or the raised beds or whatever it's going to be. So it's the actual physical infrastructure. That was the biggest sort of carbon hurdle. I also don't know if this was like a longitudinal study where they're they're checking the carbon footprint after 5 years of having a home garden setup versus the initial setup and the first yield of fruit. The other thing the study did not mention was food miles involved. And I think that's something you were sort of alluding to. Like in the US, at least, the average distance your food travels is 1,700 miles. So, again, I'm not like a carbon expert, but there's got to be some benefit to getting the fruits and vegetables from your backyard versus half the distance of the country away.
Yeah, that's definitely one big part of it's actually not that much of a part of the equation. Well, if you look objectively, it kind of makes sense that transportation would be the biggest hurdle in terms of carbon emissions, but it's not actually the biggest issue. In fact, it's the way that the farmland is being used. It's the way that chemicals are used into the soil and they are actually depleting the soil. And this sets out huge amounts of carbon dioxide. And in this whole carbon balance, transportation is only a minor thing. Obviously, it's good to reduce the food miles, but it's not that much of a huge impact. And in fact, sometimes it gets a bit complicated, but in some cases, it will even be better to, and this is linked to the food patterns of how we all eat. Like if you want to eat an apple in your early summer, then it will be more sustainable. So the carbon footprint will be lower if that apple comes from the other side of the world than if you would eat it locally. Because if you have to eat it locally, it will be harvested 9 months earlier, and it will be in a cooler that is in a controlled environment for 9 years, and that will actually have a way bigger footprint. So it's kind of like it gets quite complicated to say like, okay, this practice is bad and this is good. And that's what in all of the things that I talk about, it's not so much about what we are doing that is the problem. Like you can say home gardens are bad, or cows are bad for the environment, or soybeans are bad for the environment. Everybody comes up with some sort of a issue, and they might be true in a way, but it's not really about what it is. It's about how it is produced. This is the key issue that nobody or very little people are talking about. Like we're all talking about, oh, you should be vegan or you should only eat meat. The world's going crazy in terms of what is healthy food. Like if you go into that rabbit hole, it's endless, right? But I believe that it doesn't actually matter. It's really about how the food is produced, how the cow has lived, how that soybean has been grown. That is where the huge impact on our planet is or can be seen. Yeah. Does that make sense?
It definitely makes sense. And that's why I appreciate the opportunity to interview people like you and also have this long form format where we can spend a lot of time kind of digging into the nuance, because the apple example you gave, for example, I understood that eating seasonally, it's just going to be sort of better and it makes more sense. I didn't know that apples would be stored for 9 months. I'm sure a lot of people didn't know that, where I also, in my mind, in my very limited view of how carbon footprints and carbon emissions work, I didn't know that it would be, but it makes sense that it would be sort of flexible based on the thing that you're measuring against and the time of the year for seasonality. So it's super layered, but hopefully we can try to unpack that a little bit as we kind of go through this conversation. But we're definitely going to get to sort of best farming practices and gardening practices, but I do want to start a little bit with your background, understanding how sort of growing up in like a farming family has influenced your career path and sort of your worldview.
Yeah, I love that question. Thank you for asking that. And I have to go back way in time. So like you said it, or you mentioned it already, I grew up on a family farm. My father is a farmer. My brother is a farmer. My brother is doing some amazing work. We can talk about that more, about regenerative farming. But I grew up on this farm, and it must be at a very, very early stage. I think it was between 3 and 5 years old. When I was between 3 and 5 years old, I just got intrigued by what my father was doing on the farm. The fact that he would put seeds on the land, and that it would grow into a crop, and then it would be harvested. Like, it's one of my earliest memories of being on this planet. And that just completely blew my mind. I still remember that I started to realize how crazy how magical it is that if we take a seed, you put it in the soil, it can grow into a plant. It can even grow into a majestic oak tree. Like, how the hell is this possible? And from that fascination, I said to myself, oh, I want to grow my own food. I want to start my own vegetable garden. And at that time, what I did was I started out with radishes. I don't know why I started with radishes. Maybe my grandfather gave it to me. But this is something for your listeners as well. If somebody wants to grow vegetables at home, radishes are the easiest vegetables to grow at home. You just seed it, it pops up, you get it. A couple of weeks later, you have radishes to harvest. So as a kid, my first garden endeavor was, okay, I'm going to put some radishes in. So I did that. And what happened was I had a huge success. I was able to grow my own radishes. And then I was like, I found it. Now I can grow any kind of vegetables. And I thought, okay, if I can grow radishes, I can grow tomatoes, everything. So I bought tons of seeds. I had my own little garden. I prepared the soil and I started seeding everything everywhere. And then I thought, okay, this is so easy. I'm just going to come back a couple of weeks later and it'll be full of vegetables and I can eat it and share it with my family. Well, I guess, Parker, you know what happened next, right? I came back, like, I was with my cousin as well I think I was maybe away for a couple of weeks visiting my cousin or something. And I thought, I come back and it will be full of vegetables. Now, of course, the whole garden was overgrown with weeds because we had also put in some compost and some other things to make things grow better. And it was just full of weeds. So I was devastated. I was like, what? How is this possible? It's just like, it doesn't make sense to me. I was really devastated. And from that day onwards, I actually said, I tried to understand how nature works. And this has governed me actually throughout my life, because later on, after studying modern languages and economics, I said, I want to learn something practical. I'm going to study landscape architecture because I really want to understand more about how nature works and how we can actually play with it. So from that study, I did a bachelor's and a master's degrees. And I then I did my master's in Germany, in Munich, because the Germans, they are very good at doing things properly. So I said, okay, I'm going to go and study in Germany. And then I
very good at process.
Yeah, exactly. So I had my master's degrees and then I applied for a job thinking like, this is it. I'm going to get my 9-to-5 job. It's going to be amazing. Well, I got a job, and a couple of months down being in that job, I kind of get depressed being part of the 9-to-5 work. I said like, this is really not for me. And yeah, I kind of became depressed, I would say, but I kept doing it because I learned a lot. Like, I don't regret doing that because I learned a lot from the process of how people in Germany think and work. It's really interesting to have that experience. But then after 3 years, I said, this is really enough. I quit my job. I packed my backpack and I said, I'm going to go out into the world and travel and see where there are eco-resorts, where farms are doing something different that is good for our planet. Because obviously I became aware, like, okay, we have to do something about our climate here. This is really something that we have to take control of. And from that, I visited lots of farms. I did lots of trainings. I kept on learning and learning. And then I came back to, well, there were some other countries in between, but I came back to Belgium and started my own company. My own company is called Paulonia Landscape Architects. So in that company, we really look into garden design in a way that is aesthetic, but it is also good for our environment. So we bring those two aspects together and we bring that in harmony. And now, more recently, because I've also had a lot of experience with helping my brother on the farm, how to transition to a more regenerative farm, and we can talk about that more in depth. I now also consult other farmers globally to make the transition and to take back control of their own farm. Because whatever is happening in the environmental area, that things are not working, it's affecting the farmers today. And it's kind of mixed with the politics as well. And I see so many farmers are hurting because, well, they're kind of a boxing ball of politics, especially here in Europe. You've probably seen all of the farmers being out there. Well, I'll tell you this, my brother is one of the few farmers who isn't out there because he decided to change in a certain direction that's more in harmony with nature. And he's way more profitable today. So he doesn't have to go out on the streets and protest because he has made the shift already. And I want to help. Well, I now dedicated my life to helping farmers and gardeners and landowners to make that transition.
Yeah, it's a great point. So there's a lot we're going to want to get into, but just because we're kind of on it now, talking about the farmers, are they sort of striking and protesting because, at least in the US, I know a lot of farming, at least a lot of crops are subsidized because running a farm is just generally not profitable. Is it the same thing? Like there's subsidies have been changed or the reimbursement, something like that, where they're just not happy with what the government assistance is at this point?
Yeah, exactly. That's the reason why. So I'll tell you what, in the European Union, 90% of the budget that's being spent from the European Union is spent in agriculture. So we obviously have also national tax paying, but the part that we pay to the European Union as for taxes, 90% is spent on agriculture. And the reason why, well, we have to go a little bit back in history again, but after the World Wars, there were some big famines. Like, in Ireland, there was a huge famine. Europe was under a lot of stress. Food was not readily available, especially all of the diversity that we have today. It wasn't there. So it kind of started from that idea, okay, we never want to have hunger again in Europe. So they started to push forward an agenda that is really focused on having huge quantities of food and super industrialized and super specialized, that we would never have to experience being in famine, which is kind of a logical thinking, and it made sense. And then a couple years later, we had the 60s or the late 50s, 60s, where we have what they call the Green Revolution, where agriculture extremely changed in a very short time, in a very, very short time, where all the chemical pesticides got introduced, where all the chemical fertilizers, all the things that, in fact, increased the yields of farms. And at first, it looked like an amazing thing, right? Farmers were making more money. They were earning more. The yields increased. It was like a magic thing that they found out about. So this became so big but one important thing that we forget in this whole process, or that was forgotten in that process, is that we were depleting the soil. With each use of chemicals, you kind of get all the natural resources out of the soil. Together with that, also the carbon emissions that we talked earlier. So now we are 40, 50, 60 years later, and we kind of stuck with this system that's heavily subsidized. It's heavily industrialized. It's monoculture. Like all of the farms were put into a direction that they had to focus on one thing. And again, it all kind of makes sense, but we forgot about that we are working with nature, and that nature can only handle a certain amount of things at a certain time. So now, today, it's actually in the last 5 to 10 years, I would say, on top of the fact that the soil is depleting and farmers are losing their soil, literally, and climate change on top of that, the weather patterns get more extreme. Farmers start to see that things are not working as it used to work. So they're kind of already in a lot of stress in what's happening with how they were used to farm, because they grew up in that way. Like even my own father, it's just how things were going. When he started this, it was how things were done. And I'll tell you more, if he wouldn't have continued to industrialize and scale up, he would be out of business. So even my father is an industrial farmer, and we are changing that step by step. But he didn't have another choice. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to provide for our family. That's just how he was kind of pushed in that direction. And so now today, with the climate, and then now with more recent, this is another interesting thing that I heard in the news. I try not to listen too much to the news, but somebody said like there's a difference between somebody that goes to vote and then somebody that goes to the grocery store. It's one person, but they are in fact two different persons. So what in the politics in Europe, everybody wants a greener, more sustainable, and a better environment, and it completely makes sense. But then if they go to the grocery stores, they don't buy the organic food, they only buy the cheap food. So now the European Union and all the local governments start to say, okay, we need to cut down on chemical use, and so they say, okay, we're going to just take away the subsidies. Well, now the farmers go crazy, right? Because they're already on so much stress, and now they're going to start cutting back the subsidies that they've been getting for such a long time. So it's kind of a perfect storm that's happening now. And it's only going to get worse, I'll tell you that.
Yeah, I believe that. I appreciate you kind of walking us through the history of all that, because I think it's easy for people to get lost or caught up in the more recent narrative of, I think there's been plenty of nefarious things that have happened in the agricultural community, but to understand that a lot of this originated from sort of a fear of famine, that makes sense. So a lot of times this show is usually more around healthcare and healthcare in the US. Again, there's a lot of nefarious activity in there, but if you go back to the history, you just see the complexities and the inefficiency of the healthcare system now. You can go back and you can track the steps, and usually it's lots of well-intentioned policies that are sort of stacked on top of each other. And then you just get unintended consequences that are sort of compounding over time. So it sounds very similar to what's happening now, where a lot of these things, maybe not coming from nefarious or a malintentioned place, actually coming from a good place, but now we're just dealing with the long-term consequences of that, some of which I think has been like willful ignorance on a large part. Like, I think it's not a secret that monocropping is just depleting the soil and is just ravaging like the nutrient density of soil and of the foods that we're eating. But still, like, a lot of this started kind of from a good place. So I appreciate you walking us through that history. I think the most natural place to go is to start talking about regenerative farming. Also just the need for innovation. That's kind of what you were getting at, in that a lot of these industrialized farmers this is just how we did it when we grew up. We're going to keep doing it that way, but subsidies change, the environment changes, and we need to adapt. So I think regenerative farming is one of the more innovative approaches. So I think for anyone who's not familiar with that, getting an explanation of what regenerative farming is, and then I'd love to be able to dive into sort of the benefits and specifics of that as well.
Yeah, definitely. So I can explain that more in depth, but I'll start maybe to explain what organic farming is, because it's kind of linked to it. Now, organic farming is just the way that you say you don't want to use any, or it's not that in organic farming, you don't use chemical pesticides and chemical products, even though now today, even in the organic system, you can use organic materials such as copper, which are highly toxic, but that's part of another discussion. So this is just what organic is. Especially in Europe, it's quite highly protected. The standards are quite high. But the only thing that this, again, it's a good intention, right? We don't want to be using chemicals, and we don't want to have all these things in our food. Now, that's a good intention, but it's not fixing the problem with the soil. So they've in this whole narrative, a big part is forgotten. And now what we see in organic farming is that they have to use way more ways to do weeding and all these things, because they're so focused on not using chemicals. It's like you focus on that and then you're not solving the bigger problems. And then that's kind of where regenerative farming comes in, which is in essence a way to farm that is more in harmony with nature. And what I mean by more in harmony with nature is that if you go out and look into the world, into the natural world, into nature, where will you find a bare soil, a soil that is naked? Like go and find me a place in nature that has a bare soil. It's very difficult to find. It only happens when there's a landslide or a wildfire that you get a bare soil. So this is the first thing that we have to avoid as much as possible, to have a bare soil, because a bare soil in nature is like, it's very vulnerable. It's kind of like opening your own skin. And that's how I explain it as well, that the topsoil of our planet all across the world is kind of like our top skin. It needs to be protected. But if we continuously rip it open, it gets infections. And it's exactly the same with the soil. Now, what regenerative...
It gets dry and flaky.
Yes, it gets dry, and all of the humidity also gets lost. It evaporates way more. So that's another issue in water that we're facing more and more. But then what regenerative farming does is to, obviously, you have to disturb the soil to put your new crop and to harvest and to do all these things, but you minimize it as much as possible. And one way of doing that is to do no tillage or avoid like minimal tillage or no tillage, because what tillage does, it's an age-old practice in farming. In fact, it was how farming was revolutionized when it started, like more than 4,000 years ago. This tool enabled us to work the land more efficiently. But what it does as well is that it completely turns everything around. And I'll tell you this, in a healthy soil, there's a complex system that we don't even know everything about, that there's a huge interaction between microorganisms, between the roots, between other organisms that create a soil that is healthy. And in fact, what is more striking is that, and this is related to your work, is that what happens is in the soil, it's very similar to what happens in our gut. Now, I think in healthy lifestyle, gut is quite a bespoken topic nowadays. Well, maybe it kind of comes together with farming and agriculture, because it's now becoming more a bespoken topic in agriculture as well. Now, what we do if we till the soil completely, which like we don't want to do that, but it's a common practice, you kind of mix up all of these organisms. And to get even more in details, like each millimeter and centimeter or inch for you, each and every inch have different types of microorganisms, that some like more oxygen in the soil, some like more other things in the soil. So each layer has different types of microorganisms. So it's hugely complex. In fact, we know more about the galaxies and everything that's happening around us than what's happening under our feet. It's still like an area of research that's not completely... we don't know everything about it, let's say. So, but we do know that if you turn the soil around, it has a huge impact, and it kind of messes everything up. So in regenerative farming, you avoid that. And one way of doing that is using cover crops. So now we're getting really technical, but cover crops is actually a crop that you do between crops. So what happens is that, and I'll give an example from our own farm that I helped to install. So on our own farm, we had a rotation of potatoes and pumpkins. So we would plant the potatoes, and it was an early harvest of potatoes. So the potatoes would already be harvested in early summer here in Europe. Now, when we were not practicing regenerative farming, after the harvest of the potatoes, the land would just be like bare, and we wouldn't do anything with it for probably 9 months, because the pumpkins is only the next year in spring. So there's like a gap of 9 months where the soil is left bare. And now that I explained to you before that this is not what you want, what happens is when the soil is bare, all kinds of weeds aggressive weeds also start to grow. Now, if you then want to plant your pumpkins, you have to use pesticides to kill the weeds to start putting your pumpkins, but then you're killing the soil even more, so the pumpkins don't even perform how they should do. So what we did is we introduced a cover crop, and moreover a diverse cover crop, because in nature there's a lot of diversity. So we handpicked specific seeds that have certain functions to improve the soil, and it's a whole mix, and we implemented that. In those 9 months, the soil was able to restore itself. Moreover, it was able to perform photosynthesis, because when the soil is bare, there's no photosynthesis. So it's putting carbon from the atmosphere into the soil, and it's improving, it's creating lots of roots over the 9 months. We even see more biodiversity, more butterflies, more insects, so it has a huge impact. Now, because we select the cover crop so specifically, and it's full of annual plants that only live 1 year, the cover crop naturally starts to die off. And in that time, we are there to plant the pumpkins. Now, I'll tell you this. When I first talked about this with my father to implement this on the farm, he was like, are you crazy? Are you some kind of a hippie to think that plants are going to solve everything? He's like, never that you're going to do this on my farm. It doesn't make sense. What are the neighbors going to think? But I persisted, and together with my brother, we convinced this was 7 years ago. And we persisted, and we continued, and we said, okay, just let's do a test. Let's do half of the field your way, the old way, and our way. And we persisted in doing that. And the incredible part was that the pumpkins would grow way faster, because do you want me to tell even more in detail what happens under the soil? Is it okay to go more in depth?
Yeah, I mean, anyone who's still here at this point, you better be interested in soil, because I think soil's really interesting. Just one of the notes I had jotted down when you were talking about tilling, but yeah, I definitely want you to share more about soil. The tilling and sort of the disruption. If you were to think of soil seems to be this very intelligent thing where there's so much microbiome and sort of bacteria, and they're in particular layers for a reason. Anything in nature, it doesn't do it haphazardly. Everything is there in a particular place for a reason. So if you were to think of the layers of soil that you're talking about, disrupting them, it's you're just disrupting the natural intelligence that's sort of built into nature. So that was all I wanted to say, but yes, please go on even more about.
Yeah, we have some more time, right? So I love to talk more about the technical parts of what's happening under the soil, because it's so intriguing, because we don't see it. You have to test it, you have to prove it. And sometimes we dig up a part of the soil to see what's happening with the roots. But then now what happens is that this cover crop that I talked about, I said it kind of dies off naturally because it's annual plants. Now, what happens if you plant the pumpkin there? The roots of the new pumpkin will actually use the channels from the plants that died off. So the pumpkin will be able to grow roots way deeper, way faster. Now, what happens when drier area, when it's with climate change now, the rains don't come as frequently, but these pumpkins have way deeper roots. And on the other field, we didn't do that. So it was incredible to see that on that field, how the field was closed by the pumpkins, it was way faster. And so that also, again, because the pumpkins grow faster, it protects the soil way faster. So already it's kind of like a parabolic move up, because it stacks up the advantages. So what we then saw is it's just amazing. The soil was covered way quicker, and then the harvest was just a 20 to a 30% higher, and the inputs were way lower. We had to the way to maintain it and to weed it. On that one field that closed, there was no weeding to be done. It's still done manually with a shovel. You shovel the soil. On that other field, we still had to do that. And now comes the amazing part, is that, and this is what farmers need to see and realize, that my father, when we did that, he was like, oh my God, we never really talked about it, but he was amazed about it. And now it's become a common practice, and he's actually doing it. because he came to understand how it works. And that's something that I think this is a key aspect in making the change, is to show people or do tests and prove that it's way better. And then people also, like I'm explaining it to you now, you understand better why it's so important.
Yeah, I also like having sort of these in-depth conversations because at the very least, it's going to give people much more appreciation for everything that goes into food. I think it's so easy to just grab food from the supermarket and just not think anything of it. So just next time you're grabbing a potato, just think about everything that can go into it.
Exactly.
No, so it's really interesting. Did you know this was going to work? Like, had you seen this done elsewhere, or did you just have sort of your theoretical knowledge and you were so confident that it was going to work that you just stuck with it? Because it's such a different practice from the norm of farming. It's like you must have been hugely confident to try to implement that on your dad's farm.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And there's this great saying that we always built on the shoulders of giants, right? I didn't invent this. In fact, it was invented by nature at some point, but I had a mentor at that time who was part of a company called Soil Capital, and they are a great company that is consulting all across the world farmers to make that transition as well. And I learned it from him. And I always had that interest about how nature worked. So I didn't really understand it fully, but the moment it clicked for me, it was like, of course we have to do it. It's just complete logic. There's no doubt that this is not going to work. Like, obviously I was scared if it's going to work, but it's just how nature performs. And this is something, it's also part of my upcoming award-winning book, 12 Universal Laws of Nature, how to get the most potential out of your land. And in that book, I go quite in depth more about, look, nature has been governed by certain laws for over millions and millions and millions of years. Now, if you think that you can try and ignore these rules or even work against them, it's going to be a tough time. And this is what's happened in agriculture. They try to industrialize it, to monocrop it, do everything that is not happening in nature. Again, it's not that they wanted to do something bad or something. It's not that. It's just they didn't have the knowledge. Now, but we are now in an age where we are starting to understand more of it. So it's our responsibility to also act upon it.
Yeah, it seems like not just in agriculture, but collectively. At least I hope so. Maybe it's just the circles I run in, but it does seem like there's, from a societal, maybe cultural standpoint, that there's a slow shift back towards a better alignment, or at least there's more people talking about it. But it does feel like there's sort of a shift in that direction. So for agriculture to be moving that way too is definitely encouraging. Can you share more of the benefits of regenerative farming? So we talked about sort of the efficiency and yield and not having to, obviously the better soil quality, but can you talk about maybe the carbon capture that happens from that, the increased nutrient density? Because potatoes grown two different ways they may weigh the same, but they're not apples to apples from a nutrient density standpoint and sort of a quality standpoint.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And well, we can talk about a couple of, do you want to go first in the carbon or the health, the nutrient density aspect?
Let's go with carbon and then we can go to nutrients.
So with carbon, again, it's logical. You have to start thinking logical how nature performs in the nature, like before the humans were so dominant on our planet and we still have pristine landscapes. If you go and look at these pristine landscapes, it's very diverse. There's grasslands grazed by animals, there's forests, there's shrubs, there's all kinds of different plants. Now, if you can start to mimic that in a well-organized way, because you still have to perform, you still have to get the yield, you still have to make sure that everything is well-organized. If the purpose of your farm is to be profitable, maybe if it's not, then you can do other things. But let's say that this is the goal of your farm, then what's going to happen as well is that you will be capturing way more sunlight. Like the thing that I talked about, if the soil is bare, there's no photosynthesis happening. Now, if there's no photosynthesis happening, what's happening is that the sun goes onto the land, it heats the soil, and we get global warming, what we're faced with as well. So, whereas if you have maximum plants growing on your land through these cover crops, or there's other things like you can add trees in your system as well, but maximizing the amount of sunlight that you can harvest is just maximizing the transition of carbon dioxide. So carbon in the atmosphere, or atmospheric carbon, will be drawn into the plants, into the soil, into the roots, and it will deposit carbon even into the soil. And then we get back to how the microorganisms interact and this whole complex thing. Well, that's what's happening. If the soil is healthy, the plants will perform better at doing photosynthesis. So it's kind of like a flywheel. When you start to doing it, it keeps becoming better and better and better. So that's really how that's the incredible story of all the challenges we are facing today, is that they can be solved very rapidly if we take the right actions. It's really amazing. So, but now you understand that this will increase the carbon content of your soil, and just the benefits of having a higher carbon content is so huge. Like, just one aspect is that your soil will become more like a sponge. We all know a sponge. If you have a sponge at home, if you hold it under the water, like, it will firstly absorb the water, but then once it is saturated with water, it will drain the water through. And that's exactly what happens with that type of a soil, which is higher in carbon. It becomes like a sponge, whereas the industrial land that has been like plowed and destroyed over and over again doesn't have that capacity. Now again, we're facing with climate change, where rains come less frequently, so it just has such a huge advantage. It's gonna become like a no-brainer to farmers to go into that direction, or at least I'm trying to convince them of that, because it's like politics are trying to push them in that way. But if it's not politics, it will be climate change that will destroy their business if they don't jump on the wagon. And then what is more interesting, and we talked about it before we started our call, but the carbon creditation industry, which is, okay, we can discuss, is it greenwashing, is whatever it is, but there's a huge industry that is starting to take off, where companies that have a certain carbon footprint, or even me, if I have a certain carbon footprint, I can start paying farmers to farm in that way that I've explained, because it's going to put carbon into the soil. So I'm kind of paying my carbon credits. That's the name of it. So other than the general benefits of becoming a regenerative farmer, focusing on the health of the soil, is that you will be awarded for it financially. And I've been looking at some research, either in tree growings, I've seen some research. It's crazy what it will bring it. There's some research saying that you can get up to 50 tons per hectare sequestered into the soil. Well, it still has to be proven, but 1 ton of carbon is currently traded on the market for around $40 to $70. It's kind of still a starting industry, but it's in that range. So imagine, as a farmer, you can add $40 per ton, and if you're doing 50 tons, it's an extra, help me out here, what is it, an extra $2,000?
2,000, yeah.
An extra $2,000 that you'll earn per hectare per year. I'll tell you what, farmers are earning today, their profit margin today is less than $2,000 a year for most farmers. Way
Right.
less.
Yep.
So it's going to revolutionize the way we farm. And obviously 50 is in the high range, and this is specifically for a type of tree. Actually, it's the name of our company, Paulownia. It's a type of tree that it's called the oxy tree. And this tree is like in the class of photosynthesis. It is the best. It's always the first, because it for some reason it has an ability to grow extremely fast, and obviously when it grows faster, it can capture more carbon. So I'm looking into that as well, to start plantations of these type of trees. But even if you want to grow food, farmers will be rewarded for that. Isn't that interesting?
It seems like a really interesting way to sort of subsidize the innovative shift as it would need to be, right? Anytime you're introducing a new technology, generally it's inefficient in the beginning. So it needs to be subsidized. So yeah, that's a really clever way to do it. And also very encouraging. You said something earlier, which I've never thought of before, which is harvesting sunlight, which is like, I've been interested in sort of soil quality for a few years now, very passively, but I've never thought about the idea of harvesting sunlight. And I've always just thought, well, if you have healthier soil, that's just better because soil just absorbs carbon somehow. But I've never thought about the need for there to be some sort of probably green space or something on top that's actually grabbing the sunlight. And then that's sort of where the sequestering of carbon comes from. So I don't know. It was something you said, and like I've just never had anything click like that before. So maybe people that are listening and you've seen farms, like I know there's a fair amount of people listening in New Jersey where I grew up. We grew up in a very farm heavy area, but you know, a lot of corn, like a lot of vegetables. New Jersey is actually a great, it's called the Garden State. So there's a lot of farming and vegetable growing there, but you would see throughout the year just big empty open fields. And then I'm sure it's way worse in the Midwest where it's all monocropped, but just to kind of have that frame of thinking what else can and possibly should be growing here symbiotically for the non-growing season to sort of harvest sunlight throughout the rest of the year and sort of replenish the soil. That was a really helpful term you used.
Yeah. And this actually, just to jump on there, but this actually erases the need for chemical fertilizers because the plants are putting it into the soil. And the next crop can use that because it digests into the soil. If that makes sense.
And then the other thing you said, when you were giving the example of the pumpkins was really interesting, of whatever the ground cover was prior to that, sort of the roots, sort of like pre-digging. It's like pre-drilling a hole.
Exactly.
Where the roots, it's just way easier for them to navigate, and it's not having to struggle and fight to get through like one really tough, dense, sort of depleted soil. Or more dirt than soil, really. But then the soil is much more beneficial.
Exactly.
So can you go on to speak about the nutrient benefits of this type of farming?
Yes. I think this will blow the mind of your listeners because it's more related to health, obviously. Now we've talked about all of the other benefits that this way of farming will have. We didn't even touch upon what it will do for us humans. Now, I'll tell a story. Well, it's not a story, it's a fact. There are oranges out there that are being produced and that have no vitamin C. Now, tell me why you buy, or most people buy oranges in winter. Is because we want to have more vitamin C, right? So that is crazy. So if we now farm in this specific way, we'll have back oranges that do have huge quantities of vitamin C. And I'll tell you something more interesting even that I heard about. There's a new technology that should be coming out soon, and it will probably, the ability is that it can be just part of our iPhones. It's a scan that will measure the nutrient density of fruits and vegetables and any food. And the way it kind of works is that food that is higher in nutrient density vibrates at a way higher frequency. So if you have a machine that can, or not a machine, but a scanner on your phone that can detect the frequencies, you can actually already define if it's going to be high in nutrient density or not. So that's something I'm very hopeful and curious about, because imagine now we as consumers, we go to the supermarket and we can actually scan the food and it's like, oh, this is an orange and it doesn't have vitamin C. Why the hell would I pay money for it, even if it's super cheap. Why would I even buy it, right? So that's something interesting that I'm very hopeful about. And yeah, just to tie it back to where we started with the whole idea of farming being something that we have enough food for the whole planet or for certain areas here, specifically in Europe, but it's the same story in the US, that by focusing on quantity, the whole nutrient density is not considered. So now we're growing huge amounts of food, but it actually doesn't have any or it has very low nutrients, and it actually is probably the main cause for most of our more modern diseases. All kinds of cancers, obesity, all these things are related to how the food is produced. Now, if the nutrient density would be way higher, we wouldn't even have to eat that much of the same food, because it would be packed with way more vitamins, minerals, even proteins, everything that we need. So again, if we can quantify that, we can inform consumers to say, like, even if that product is cheaper, it's not healthier and it's not going to give you the nutrients that you need. Just buy a little bit less, and because of the higher quality, it's going to provide you with way better things. And then this is where you come in, that the food that we eat is really who we are, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you brought up oranges as an example, because I had read something maybe 3 months ago. I thought it was hyperbole, saying that you would need to eat 8 oranges today to get the equivalent sort of nutrient density of an orange in like the 1960s or something like that. God. But it's probably not exaggerated if there are in fact oranges being produced with no vitamin C, which is usually when you think of, oh, what's a good fruit for vitamin C, you think of oranges. So maybe that wasn't hyperbole. And then the other thing I wanted to mention, that is a very interesting technology about the frequency of foods. I never understand the stuff maybe as well as I want to, but like Nikola Tesla says, like, if you want to understand the secrets of the universe, like, think in terms of frequency and vibration. So when you said frequency, I'm like, there's probably something to that. Maybe in a few years I'll understand it better, but it sounds like one of those things that is just very in harmony with nature, if you will.
Yeah, definitely. And I can even, if I can jump in there, this is again how nature works. It's part of one of the laws is, well, it's also in my book, one of the laws is the law of vibration. And it's proven in nature that if a plant becomes sick because of whatever reason, that plant will also vibrate on a lower frequency. And this in terms will attract insects to kill it, because that's how nature works. It kind of decomposes and it gets rid of what it doesn't need. So that's how insects actually get attracted to plants. Now, let's tie it back to modern industrial agriculture. Most of the plants are not healthy. So all of these farmers that are doing it in that way are faced with a lot of insect problems. Now, they use chemicals, obviously, to get rid of it, but it's like, it's the flying wheel in the wrong direction. Like, if your plants are not performing well, they're going to be eaten by a lot of insects. And that's just how nature works. You can try and work against it. We've done it for 60 years, probably more. But it's not an endless street.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like that. Again, just kind of going in, especially if you're looking at long enough timelines, like 60 years is just a tiny blip.
It's nothing.
So clearly it's not sustainable.
It's for a blink of an eye in the universe.
Yeah, like with enough manpower and resources, you can do it. And I think that's what we've done. We just be like, we're just going to throw manpower and technology and resources at this.
Yeah.
And it's worked up until it doesn't. So I'm glad there is a shift away from that. I kind of want to talk about climate change, sustainability, more from like an architectural standpoint, because I live in Phoenix, Scottsdale. So it's already a very hot place, right? So This is going to have to be one of the first places that's really taking steps to mitigate or sort of like build cities for the future. So I'm not sure how you want to take this, but I know you have expertise in landscape design. And I'm just kind of curious how you think cities of the future are going to have to be designed or redeveloped to deal with warmer climates and not just building like big concrete buildings everywhere.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think the greenery that we can grow in the cities will have has already a huge impact on the climate, just the local environment, not even on a global perspective. But there's research about streets with and without trees, the temperature difference in the heat of summer, it's like can be 20 degrees Celsius, no, not 20, but 10 degrees Celsius. That already has a huge impact. So it's just, it kind of just makes it logical to focus on green infrastructure in cities. And I know that you are from an environment that's very arid and very difficult, but even in those environments, you can, with very low water input, you can actually grow plants that are more adapted to these difficult circumstances and still have like a soil coverage, right?
Yeah, I had somebody on here. I think when this comes out, it'll be 2 or 3 episodes before you. His website is urbanfarm.com, and he ran an urban farm on 1/3 of an acre here in Phoenix for like 30 years. Now he lives in Asheville, but he still sort of does seminars out here because he had such a big following for so long. But it was incredible to hear.
Isn't he the guy from the movie? Wasn't he in a quite known documentary?
He might have been. His name is Greg Peterson.
Yeah, I think I heard about him. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's funny that you would have heard of him and sort of in these circles. But it was amazing how on such a small plot of land and in such an arid environment, he goes, "Oh, there's plenty of things that prefer to grow out here." And it was just really eye-opening to see how much you can grow in sort of an environment like this. And he's like, because I had my basically entire plot of land so well organized from a sort of a landscape architecture standpoint, he goes, it helped with water capture, cooling my house. He goes, I had so much greenery. And then he also had so many like fruits and vegetables that were grown there throughout the year. It was very encouraging.
Yeah, exactly. He's doing the right things for the soil and how to grow the plants, and probably with a minimal water supply system. That's the thing, right? That if you want to grow your own garden and you're just like thinking like, oh, I just have to water it all the time, but you don't care about how to improve the soil, how to treat the soil, how to make compost even, then it's not going to work. All your plants are just going to die, especially in your environment. So it's super important to get like the right guidance and the knowledge of and following the people that have already done a lot of research around it, and again jumping on the back of on the shoulders of the giants, right?
Yeah, exactly. No, it was he provided a lot of really good resources, so hopefully people will check those out if you're interested in sort of at least the desert growing needs. Also, because I live like in a condo, so my main question was like, how do I start growing stuff on a balcony? He goes, oh, you can definitely do it. He's like, you don't need a lot of space necessarily.
Yeah, that's right.
Can you talk more about like business in the future? Because I think I don't think we were recording yet, but I think you're in such a good space, given what you do, because there's going to be a need to, I think even from a landscape design perspective, here in Arizona, we have a lot of non-native species just to make things look better around here. But you get sort of, because we brought in a lot of non-native species, this is the first time in my life I've ever had allergies, but a ton of people here have allergies because there's a bunch of stuff growing here that shouldn't be.
Really?
So I think there's going to be a need to shift, back to more native species, and not just here, but anywhere we're living. So can you just talk about like what the future of sort of landscape design is going to look like? And I think it's also just going to be, I think that sector is going to grow so enormously over the next 20 or 30 years because there's such a need for utilizing the Earth's resources in a much more efficient manner.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think it's just gonna become inevitable, right? Like if for your home or for your property or for your city, you can get an expert in that will make the city way more livable, way more attractive. It will attract more investors. It will become more sustainable on the long run. So in that way, it's just, I mean, we can talk about the future, but it's already happening today. I see a lot of my clients that they just don't have the knowledge of how to do it. Like I have a masterclass where I teach people how they can design, create, and maintain their own garden. And we talked about a couple of things. It dives into the soil more in depth as well, but then also how to use which plants and all this knowledge. And people are amazed by it because there's also a huge audience that wants to learn it themselves. And then talking about the future, actually yesterday I was in a AI course. I took a 2-day artificial intelligence course because this industry is gonna completely shift how our world will look. Not even in 10 years, probably not even in 5 years, probably in less than 3 years. And in fact, what it will do, I think, is it will erase a lot of the jobs on our planet that nobody likes to do. Like just people doing 9-to-5 jobs to like kind of be a corporate slave. And all of these jobs are under pressure, I think, very soon. So I'm in that way, I'm actually very hopeful about it because this will open up a whole new world that we can actually start focusing on things that we like doing. Why not become a gardener, or why not learn about gardening, or why not create a whole community of gardeners that know how to do it good for our planet? And in fact, it will be the only way because our climate is only going to become more rough. It's already like the damage that's been done over the last 60 years. And in fact, it goes back to the beginning of like the climate change that we're facing today. Many people say, it's because of the industries and everything, but it actually goes way back. It goes to the hunter-gatherers that started to change the landscape because they were hunting and gathering, and then they started farming, and this was where already the big impact changed. Like in the Roman times, they cut down more than half of the forests in Europe. So we shouldn't just, we don't have to blame anybody, but it goes way back. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that with AI, that is going to revolutionize our industry and probably robots as well. It's going to open a whole new world of people to do a job that they might actually like. And I think one of which can be farming, gardening. So I see a lot of potential for that in the future. People learning it themselves and farmers becoming more proficient in doing it in harmony with nature.
Yeah, I think there's something incredibly therapeutic about working with your hands, with soil, with dirt, and then also something related to food. Just it's so innate to our nature. I think for a lot of people, that'd be a very gratifying thing. I think the concern is that gardening takes a lot of time, and there can be failure involved in it early on, as you found out when you're like, I'm just going to go plant seeds everywhere. I'm going to come back and I'm going to have my bounty of food. And it was not the case. So I think a lot of people have been discouraged up until this point. Can you share a little bit more about what your masterclass involves? Just to kind of give people an idea of like kind of the step-by-step, how you take people through that.
Yeah, definitely. And I really like what you said is like, it kind of clicked for me that people don't have to go through my whole lifetime of learning and experiencing all these wins and failures, because that's what I've been going through. And I've gathered massive amounts of information. So I've boiled this down now into a masterclass where it's completely online, and you can learn how to do everything exactly to build that dream garden, that garden that you've always dreamed of. And in fact, that's the name of the program. It's How to Create the Garden of Your Dreams Masterclass. So it really dives into that urge of people to become gardeners, because it's something magical that's intrinsically part of our being human, to have a connection with nature. Gardens are the best way to have a direct connection with nature. And as well, what you brought up, that the fact that if you put your hands into the soil, it gives you, it elevates your mood. And it's not just the fact that you're doing something physical. There's even research that's proven now that all of these microorganisms that I was talking about earlier, that if you put your hands into the soil, these microorganisms will get the healthy ones that you want in your garden. You're going to absorb them in your own body, and they're going to improve your gut health and your brain health. Because I told that to you, that the microorganisms in our soil are actually very similar, or some are exactly the same as in our own gut. So now if you become a gardener, it will just transform your whole life in many aspects. And that's what you learn in this program.
It sounds like a great program. I did a lot of landscaping when I was growing up, growing up in that part of New Jersey. Like I mentioned, you just end up working on farms doing landscaping. And I always thought I was so happy at that time. And I just so thoroughly enjoyed it. And there's probably something to be said for the lack of stress that a 17-year-old has in general. But I've also just been like, every job I've had since then, I've been like sort of chasing that. I'd be like, when am I going to be able to feel this again? And I think there is just this innate part of just working with nature that you probably can't find unless you're working with nature in some other field. So I'd highly encourage people, if you have any time to do it, to go to a community garden, start your own garden. Do you think community gardens are going to become much more prominent as we move forward?
I definitely believe that, especially in the urban or in the surrounding of bigger cities and even in cities. Because if you're living in a city and you choose to live in a city, which it does have a lot of advantages, you have everything close, you live in a vibrant environment, but the access to greenery the surfaces are just way smaller. So if you now live in an apartment and you have that urge to work on a garden or on the land or grow your own food, you can go out to these community gardens. I've heard there's even ways you can just get a square meter, which is like, what is that, 9 square foot or something. So you can start with that, and you'll be amazed how much food you can grow on such a small surface. Or if you just say, I just like looking at something beautiful, you can grow flowers. So I see a lot of potential in that. In fact, I wrote my master thesis about that, specifically in the area of South Africa and Cape Town, because the way I looked at it is that what we tried to investigate is that with the racial segregation that happened there, and obviously apartheid is done, but it's still how to say it in the correct way, there's still a lot of issues around a lot of racial issues in South Africa, and other bigger issues, obviously. And the way we looked at it is that community gardens could actually be a way to empower the local communities to learn a skill of growing their own food, to grow healthy food, to connect with other people, that it can become like a meeting point, to share ideas, that it's something that has incredible power of changing environments. It's like working together with a local group on a mutual goal. Yeah.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. Do you ever do consulting for like local governments?
Yes, we do that. At this stage, we don't have any local government projects. I'm happy to work with local governments, but I see that it can be a kind of a slower process. So I love to work with private clients because it's just faster.
Yeah, they make a decision, then you just do it.
Yeah, exactly. And we do work with developers as well. It's not public, but it's semi-public. So I'm working now on a huge rooftop garden. We've filed the permission. The building permission has just been accepted. So we're going to work more on the execution planning. This is still half of my work is still related to one-on-one clients that we do the whole design process for them. Because obviously there's a group of people that want to do it themselves, but then there's another group of people that they don't have the time, they have busy jobs. and they just want to have it look like they want to have it done for them. So it's kind of it started to be 4 pillars in the business now. The masterclass, I have also a masterclass for farmers. I have one-on-one gardening clients, and yeah, that's about it. I think it's busy these days.
Okay. Yeah, no, I can imagine. That was the other thing I wanted to ask. Do you do consulting for farmers? Because I'm sure a lot of this is, it's passed down sort of generationally of, so my dad did it, you get handed the farm, this is how I do it. So it can be a lot, it sounds like, to sort of shift the farming operations from traditional farming to regenerative. Do you do consulting for like independent farms as well?
Yes, definitely. So same as with my garden clients, I have developed a masterclass. This masterclass is called Farms of Eden, because my goal is to create a huge community all across the world of farmers that decide to make a change in the world and decide to take action, to change the way their farm is structured, that they can build something that is profitable, that they can be proud of, that they don't have to shy away of using bad chemicals, that they can build something for the next generations to come. So that's something that we've been getting a lot of success with as well. And yeah, it's a lot of fun to do, to be in these different fields, because in the end of the day, they are all linked to these universal laws that I discuss in my book. What applies in a garden is... Sorry, say again?
When's your book going to come out?
It's going to be out very soon. I just was talking to my publisher a couple of weeks ago in Canada. We're finishing up all the drafts and everything. So it's going to be out, I want to say, in the next 2 months. Let's see if that works.
Okay. We could probably coordinate this to come out right around the book launch if you want.
Oh yeah, that'd be amazing.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'd like to hear a little bit more about it as well. We've covered a lot today. Is there anything else that you want to share before kind of wrapping this up?
Well, what I do want to offer to your audience, if somebody feels connected to what I've explained, and also is like this is something that I talk about, but all of my clients are action takers. They're committed. They want to make change. So if this relates to anybody who's listening here, I want to offer them to jump on a free 30-minute consulting call with me. So in those 30 minutes, we can look at their project and look what the bigger problems are and how we can actually solve them. So this is something that I want to offer to your audience here.
That's great. I really appreciate that. And anyone listening, please do take advantage of that. I think this would be, Matthieu would be a great resource for you. So
yeah, we
please
can share
take advantage.
A Calendly link, and then you can find all the details there.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll definitely link that in the description. So do you have a closing message you'd like to leave with everyone before I let you go?
That's a good question. Well, I think it's just that if people feel an urge or a tendency to take action in doing something that is good for their local environment and for our planet, then they should do that in whatever way is possible. So I really encourage people to go into this field of what we can call, let's call it green architecture, infrastructure, farming. There's a lot of ways of putting a name on it, but if you feel the urge to go into that field, definitely do it, because it's the future. I think that it's the only thing that will be profitable in the future. Like I'm 100% behind the idea that if you don't consider these aspects, you will be out of business. So I heavily encourage people to do something good for our planet and do well in business. And in fact, that's my podcast that's by the time this comes out, the podcast will be out as well. So it's called the Regenerative Design Podcast, and I interview world-leading authorities that are doing something great for our planet and are doing good in business. Because what I hear far too often is that people think, if we do something good for our planet, it's not going to be profitable. But I'm a strong believer that it's the exact opposite, because if it's not going to be good for our planet and good for business, so being profitable, then it's not sustainable. That's my vision on that. And I think I want to end with that note.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. We're definitely going to link to your podcast in the show notes as well. And yeah, that's, again, a lot of this has been really encouraging. I think the common theme kind of throughout this conversation was working in harmony with nature. So I think even in business, that's possible. And I'm glad you're sort of highlighting the path forward with that and speaking with people who are being innovators in that space and running profitable businesses and doing it sustainably and doing it in harmony with nature. So I think that's probably a good way to conclude this episode. Matthieu, this is a lot of fun, and I really appreciate you kind of sharing everything you did. This is probably very different from a lot of the episodes I've done. So anyone still listening at this point, hopefully you've enjoyed sort of this deep dive into soil, regenerative farming, and I think what is going to be the future of business and agriculture kind of as we go forward.
Awesome, Parker. Thank you very much for bringing me on the show. You're a great host, and hope to be here back someday.
Yeah, I'd love to have you on for round two once kind of we get this out, let everyone digest it, collect some questions, and do another episode. I think that'd be really great.
Awesome. I'll have more exciting news to share.
Great. Thanks so much. Hey everyone, that's all for today's show. I want to thank you so much for stopping by and watching, especially if you've made it all the way to this point. If you'd like to be notified when new episodes are going to be released, feel free to subscribe and make sure you hit the bell button as well. To learn more about today's guest, feel free to look in the description. You can also visit the podcast website, which is exploringhealthpodcast.com. That website will also be linked in the description. As always, likes, shares, comments are a huge help to me and to this channel and to the show. So any of that you can do, I would really appreciate. And again, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.